In your text, Dr. Nash has dealt well with naturalism. I'm just going to give a review of some things with regard to naturalism and then paint it for you as far as its implications with regard to the clash of science between science and faith, and the repudiation on the part of some in the field of science of the idea of God, and show whether or not that is a warranted view. So philosophical naturalism is to be differentiated from methodological naturalism. Philosophical naturalism is that philosophically, my presupposition is there is no God, and all there is the universe. That's all there is, and it's just the cosmic machinery grinding away. Methodological naturalism is that I, as a scientist, doing my work, do not factor God into my calculations because I cannot. But that doesn't mean that I don't believe that God is there. That's a differentiation. So here's the way that Dr. Nash portrays naturalism. This is not somebody who loves nature like John Muir or somebody like that. That's not the kind of naturalism we're talking about. Where the other term for this, and it's a synonym for it, is materialism. And there it doesn't mean the acquisition of stuff. But if we say naturalism or materialism, it means that all that there is matter and energy, or all there is the universe. So William Halverson, who is a naturalist, says naturalism asserts, first of all, that the primary constituents of reality are material entities. I'm not denying the reality, the real existence of such things as hopes and plans and behavior, language, logical inferences, and so on. What I'm asserting, however, is that anything that is real is, in the last analysis, explicable as a material entity or as a form or a function or an action of a material entity. And so the term that's oftentimes used is that those other things are epiphenomena, that they're upon. Epi is a prefix in Greek for upon, and so that these are phenomena that are that platformed upon the natural world, and they just come forth as a consequence of the natural world. So one has to ask oneself which story is true. The story that begins this way, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim veha'aretz, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, or the one that begins this way, with a cosmic explosion. Now you can be a believer and hold to the view of there being a Big Bang. The Big Bang is actually not problematic, as some Christians believe. But this one, when I'm saying this one, means that this is all there is. Everything that exists now, exploded into existence out of nothing. And what's going on here, if you look at the picture, the bright spot is the singularity and everything coming into being that it first comes into being. And of course, the early stars just have helium and hydrogen. That's what they're composed of. They're giant size, they burn up fast, and so there comes the second generation of stars. That second generation of stars is the place where we have the creation of carbon. And that's really the beginnings of the potentiality of there being organic life. All organic life is carbon-based. And so that from that you can see little pieces of what look like a drawing of a molecule in the picture that's given. Ultimately we get all the way down at the bottom on the right hand, DNA. And so that all of this came into being accidentally just through an explosive process. That's naturalism. You can be a theistic evolutionist and believe that everything exploded into being, like the scripture says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, and that God was guiding the whole process, and you can actually believe what we call theistic evolution. I'm not suggesting that. I don't hold to that view, but it is important for you to know that in England and in a lot of the developed countries of the West, the evangelical church primarily holds to a view of creation like this, that there can be a harmony between science, when it's evolutionary science, and faith. I don't hold, as I say, to this view. My position is what's called the framework hypothesis, and I don't know if we'll have time to unpack that in this course at all. But the contrast is between the view back here that says in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, and the view here, which is that it all just came into being naturalistically out of nothing. Which, there's an old saying in Latin, ex nihilo nihil fit, out of nothing, nothing comes. And so, how do we get something from nothing? That's a free lunch, kind of. And so, why is there something rather than nothing? Why does the universe exist? And where did it come from, and where is it heading? These are questions that believers and unbelievers need to address. Is it the ultimate reality behind which there is nothing, or is there something beyond it? And is there someone behind it? And so going forward, are we in the universe with its profusion of galactic beauty and subtle biological complexity? So that's macro and micro. That's macro, the kind of things we're seeing now through the Hubble telescope and other space telescopes that we have out there. And then also the biological complexity that we're seeing at not just the macro level of what we can see of living organisms, but at the micro level, even down at the subatomic level, this subtle biological complexity. Is this all nothing but the product of irrational forces acting on mindless matter and energy in an unguided way? It's kind of an awful huge leap to believe that things work this way. We don't see this happening around us anyway. Is human life ultimately only one, admittedly improbable, but nevertheless fortuitous arrangement of atoms in many ways? If it had been spun out differently, would we look very different from what we are, or would human beings not even have arisen? How could we be in any sense special, since we now know that we inhabit a tiny planet orbiting a fairly undistinguished star far out in an arm of a spiral galaxy containing billions of similar stars, a galaxy that's only one of billions distributed throughout the vastness of space? How can we be special if we're that teeny tiny? And since certain basic properties of our universe, like the strength of the fundamental forces of nature and the number of observable space and time dimensions, are supposedly the result of random effects operating at the origin of the universe, then surely there could well be other universes with very different structures. This is speaking about the multiverse. That's the claim. And we will do some more looking at the multiverse further on in the course and what it was that drew forth the claim of the multiverse. May it not be that our universe is only one in a vast array of parallel universes forever separated from each other? Is it not therefore absurd to suggest that human beings have any ultimate significance? If this universe in which we are so incredibly tiny and insignificant is only one amongst many universes, I mean, how can we have any significance at all? Their measure in a multiverse would seem to be effectively reduced to zero. This is John Lennox in God's Undertaker explaining the secular view. He's not coming from this perspective. He's a believer who's oftentimes debated those who hold to naturalism. So as we consider this kind of a picture, the immensity out of which human beings are supposed to have come forth dwarfs the individual human and calls into question whether or not we have any special significance at all. This is Richard Dawkins, and this is when he's kind of in his prime. He's an older man now. He's still alive. This is when he was the Simony Professor of Public Understanding of Science at Oxford. This is when I was taking courses at Oxford, that he was in his heyday and had just written The God Delusion. The God Delusion is a poorly written book by the views of most scientists. And so it's only those who kind of have this rabid naturalism, people like Daniel Dennett and Harris, and the late Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris. These kind of folks, William Provine, who did the late William Provine, these are the kind of folks who kind of rejoice in this sort of thing, but they are actually in the minority in the world of science. Isn't it rather self-deceptive, this view says, naturalism, to imagine that amongst the billions of stars out there, our little yellow star and its satellite called Earth are unique? And so when we get a picture like this and we realize that as we draw in closer to the picture, that our sun is so tiny and infinitesimal that from this standpoint we don't even see it as standing out as being a bright spot. And Earth is there by that sun. How can we think we're important? Which worldview fits together best with science? Atheism or theism? That's really the question. What does science harmonize with? So this is, I mentioned him already, this is Carl Sagan, who was in the habit of saying, and I mentioned that Neil deGrasse Tyson now says, with the show Cosmos, he says, the cosmos is all there is, was, or ever shall be. meaning there's nothing outside of the material universe. There's nothing spiritual, and there's nothing that's something that can't be measured in that way. This is a famous quote from Dawkins. He says, "The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference." That's his opinion, though. It's important for us to understand that's an opinion. There are Christians who are Darwinian. We'll see Simon Conway Morris later on in this view, who do hold to evolution, who would say that's a ridiculous conclusion. Okay. Here's Provine. He's died of cancer since he made these claims, but he was a well-loved professor at Cornell. He says, "Naturalistic evolution has clear consequences that Charles Darwin understood perfectly." Not really. Darwin didn't draw these conclusions. Thomas Henry Huxley, who we call Darwin's bulldog, drew these conclusions. But Darwin was not this acerbic, and his relinquishment of faith in God was a consequence of a deep sorrow at the loss of his daughter. It wasn't a consequence of the inevitability of the implications of his theory. So really, this is Thomas Henry Huxley, not Darwin. No gods worth having exist. No life after death exists. No ultimate foundation for ethics exists. No ultimate meaning in life exists. And human free will is non-existent. We are entirely determined. We just don't realize it. In other words, your personality and your sense of free will is an illusion. You're in a determinist, predetermined universe. It's interesting that one writing that and making that claim thinks that his or her words have meaning when we're saying this if we're completely predetermined. Richard Lewontin, Harvard biologist, said, "Science itself has been refashioned into a machine for cranking out strictly materialist theories. The reason science has been so redefined is because we have an a priority out of the starting gate commitment, a commitment to materialism." That's materialism as a synonym for naturalism. And here Scott Todd, who is an educator, said in Nature, the journal Nature, one of the two leading journals, Nature and Science, the two leading journals in the life sciences, he said something that a number of people criticized that they wished he hadn't said it quite so plainly. And it's when the intelligent design argument for the existence of God was gaining a lot of ground in the world of science. He said, even if all the data points to an intelligent designer, he's talking about the cosmic anthropic principle, which at first there was a weak cosmic anthropic principle, and then there was a strong cosmic anthropic principle, the idea that the universe appears to be prepared or made for human beings. When it was in its heyday, he says, such a hypothesis is excluded from science because it is not naturalistic. So if I say out of the starting gate that God is not in the equation, and we won't consider the data that would seem to indicate a maker, it's kind of my mind is made up, don't confuse me with the facts. If you listen to the media and read the popular periodicals, you can be left with the impression that Sagan, Dawkins, Provine, Tyson, deGrasse Tyson, and Lewontin are typical representatives of the thought processes of research scientists. However, the fact is that they are not. They represent an extreme fringe in the sciences who are vehemently anti-religion and who claim that the data of their various fields allow no other interpretation than their own. This is 1997. There was a survey that was done in 1916, and Edward Larson of the University of Georgia found that by repeating this very same survey all this time later, so that's, what is that, 81 years later, 1916 to 1997, he found that the depth of religious faith among scientists has not budged, regardless of whatever scientific and technical advances this century has wrought. Then, as now, about 40% of the responding biologists, physicists, and mathematicians said they believed in a God who, by the survey's strict definition, actively communicates with humankind and to whom one may pray in expectation of receiving an answer. And when I say that these guys who are the naturalists and who are so strongly against the idea of God, such as Dawkins and those like him, are in the minority, they really are. The other scientists, about 60%, although they may not be theists, recognize and respect the faith of their fellow scientists who are. So this is Stephen Jay Gould. In my first lecture, I mentioned him, said I like him. He was not a Christian. He was a Jew by birth, but he's a secular Jew. He did not practice his Judaism. And he talked about he thought that was a lack in his life, not having faith in his life. And so Stephen Jay Gould was a paleontologist who was the head of the biology department at Harvard for many years. And I've said some other things about him already in this course. And here, this is in a journal where he's writing, and he's kind of rebuking people like Dawkins. To say it for all my colleagues, and for the umpteen millionth time, from college bull sessions to learned treatises, science simply cannot, by its legitimate methods, adjudicate the issue of God's possible superintendence of nature. We neither affirm nor deny it. We simply can't comment on it as scientists. Now, when Dawkins read this, he said he can't be serious, right? It's true. He's like was saying, I don't believe him. I don't believe he's really serious. He wrote a book called Rock of Ages, which is a really interesting book. He puts forth the idea, this is, I'm talking about Stephen Jay Gould, of what he calls non-overlapping magisteria, N-O-M-A. And he's basically saying, religions stay in your lane, and we biologists, we will stay in our lane. Now, Alistair McGrath, the scientist turned church historian at Oxford, who was one of my lecturers, he wrote a book that he responded to that book in, and he put forward the idea of POMA, partially overlapping magisteria, that science and religion do have some overlap. So going back to what's being said here by Gould, he says, if some of our crowd have made untoward or inappropriate statements claiming that Darwinism disproves God, then I will find Mrs. McInerney, this is his teacher, his math teacher from when he's a little boy, and have their, he'd spoken about her already in the article, and have their knuckles rapped for it, as long as she can equally treat those members of our crowd who have argued that Darwinism must be God's method of action. Science can work only with naturalistic explanations. That's methodological naturalism. That's not philosophical naturalism. It can neither affirm nor deny other types of actors, like God, in other spheres, the moral realm, for example. Forget philosophy for a moment. The simple empirics, the facts of the past 100 years, should suffice. Darwin himself was agnostic, having lost his religious beliefs upon the tragic death of his favorite daughter. But the great American botanist Asa Gray, who favored natural selection and wrote a book entitled Darwiniana, was a devout Christian. Move forward 50 years. Charles D. Walcott, discoverer of the Burgess Shale fossils, whom, by the way, Stephen Jay Gould, his whole research and his doctoral work was focused on, as was the work of Simon Conway Morris, who I've mentioned to you, and he's still alive, and he's considered the leading paleontologist in the world today. So Charles D. Walcott, discoverer of the Burgess Shale fossils, was a convinced Darwinian and an equally firm Christian, who believed that God had ordained natural selection to construct a history of life according to his plans and purposes. This is called theistic evolution. Move on, and this is, by the way, if you see in the church today folks who are involved in biologos, Francis Collins, the former head of the National Institutes of Health, and who is the head of the Human Genome Project, and N.T. Wright, the English theologian, are some of the leading figures involved in biologos. Biologos is theistic evolution. Move on another 50 years to the two greatest evolutionists of our generation. G.G. Simpson was a humanist agnostic. However, Theodosius Dobzhansky was a believing Russian Orthodox. Either half of my colleagues are enormously stupid, meaning the believers, or else the science of Darwinism is fully compatible with conventional religious beliefs and equally compatible with atheism, thus proving that the two great realms of nature's factuality and the source of human morality do not strongly overlap. This is in Scientific American, and it's entitled Impeaching a Self-Appointed Judge. What he's originally responding to is Philip Johnson, who was a proponent of intelligent design. And Johnson was a lawyer, and he was just approaching this whole thing with logic. But Gould is saying, we can't adjudicate the existence of God in the field of science. This is Lawrence Krauss, an atheist and professor of astronomy, chair of the physics department at Case Western Reserve University, where, by the way, the author of your primary text, Ron Nash, was the head of the philosophy department for 20 plus years. He was the chair. This is in his article on the side of the angels, although he doesn't believe in angels. And he says, not only is it inappropriate to try to convince people of the validity of scientific theories by first arguing that their deeply held beliefs are silly, it's also clear that the existence of God is a metaphysical question which is for the most part outside the domain of science. This is Dr. Eugenie Scott, Executive Director of the National Center for Science Education. And here's what she says. Science is a limited way of knowing. We limit ourselves to natural causes. It is methodological naturalism. We do this not because we don't believe in God, but because the essence of science is testing ideas against the natural world. If there is an omnipotent force in the universe, you cannot hold it constant so that you can do tests. Because we cannot test omnipotent actions, we leave them out of science. But as my friend Robert Pennock has said, to say nothing of God is not to say God is nothing. We don't describe the process of evolution and then say, and God had nothing to do with it. Michael Shermer, who's the editor of Skeptic magazine, William Provine, who is now deceased and was at Cornell, and Richard Dawkins are simply wrong when they say their unbelief is compelled by science. This is Sir Fred Hoyle, and he did some famous work together with the Indian astronomer Chandra Wickrama Singh, and they were working together at Oxford. And as he began to see the implications of the cosmic fine-tuning of the universe, there's 55 different variables, with all of which, if they're even slightly different, we don't get the universe we're in, and there's no possibility for life to arise. As he looked at all this, he said, and this is in the time when we're talking about intelligent design, he was not a proponent of intelligent design. He was not professedly a Christian, but he said a common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect, that sounds like God, has monkeyed with physics as well as with chemistry and biology, and there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. The numbers one calculates from the facts seem to me so overwhelming as to put this conclusion almost beyond question. And John Lennox, whom I cited, actually spent a good deal of time together with Hoyle and witnessed to him and to Chandra Wickrama Singh. And so this is St. John's College Library at Oxford, Master of the Universe, the life and work of Fred Hoyle after he was deceased. It says, if anyone directly, this is quoting him, if anyone directly and straightforwardly in this matter without being deflected by a fear of incurring the wrath of scientific opinion, if one proceeds directly and straightforwardly in this matter without being deflected by a fear of incurring the wrath of scientific opinion, one arrives at the conclusion that biomaterials, with their amazing measure or order, must be the outcome of intelligent design. Now, he was not somebody who was promoting intelligent design. That's a term he was using to describe the implications of the cosmological anthropic principle. This is Paul Davies. He's probably the science writer that I have read the most. He's a theoretical physicist, cosmologist, and astrobiologist. He currently holds a position of Professor of Natural Philosophy in the Australian Centre for Astrobiology at Macquarie University. He is an Australian by background. His previous academic appointments were at the universities of Cambridge, London, Newcastle upon Tyne, and Adelaide. The first three are in England, the next one back in his native Australia. His research has ranged from the origin of the universe to the origin of life and includes the properties of black holes, the nature of time, and quantum field theory. The Washington Times calls him the best science writer on either side of the Atlantic. He says in his book, The Mind of God, that phrase comes from Stephen Hawking. He says, if we could understand the equations by which everything comes into existence, we would know the mind of God. So speaking of the mind of God, he says the apparent fine-tuning of the laws of nature, necessary of conscious life as to evolve in the universe, carries the clear implication that God has designed the universe so as to permit such life and consciousness to emerge. Einstein was not a Christian. He was a Jew by his background. He spoke about God a lot, but he was not a proponent of Judaism as far as it as a faith. But he did believe in God. That's very clear. From his experience in the sciences, he thought that human explanations of God were insufficient. But he says religion without science is blind. Science without religion is lame. And this is a man who I've had the opportunity to meet in person and to hear him lecture at the Faraday Center in Cambridge. And he's referred to as the rational atheist, Michael Roos. He is a self-described hardline Darwinian philosopher. But in speaking about these four horsemen of the new atheism, he said, "The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins makes me embarrassed to be an atheist." And he's collegial with Christians. So you look on the right, see that book, Debating Design from Darwin to DNA? It's edited by William Dembski, the primary proponent of intelligent design, and Michael Roos. They worked together, and they did presentations together, giving the alternative views of how human beings came into existence. He remains an atheist, but he is very friendly and polite and enjoyable to speak with for believers. So these are going to be on Populi for you to read, the parable and the story of Aunt Matilda. I'm not going to unpack them here. Both of them are illustrations of the fact that there are two ways of seeing things. There is that which describes the what, the physical phenomena, and that which describes the why. I'll just tell you, the one has to do with light seen out on the ocean at nighttime, flashes of light. The other one has to do with this cake that's right here, and what is it composed of as opposed to why was it made. You'll have to read these for yourself and respond to them. So the conclusion here is that philosophical naturalism is an enemy of faith. That's the position that Carl Sagan is espousing when he says the cosmos is all there is, was, or ever shall be. But methodological naturalism is not. Rather, it's merely a limitation placed upon science by its own epistemic, how do we know what we know, restrictions. Top scientists tell us that philosophical naturalism is not a necessary or even appropriate deduction from either the scientific method itself or the findings of scientific research. I think I'm going to bypass a couple of slides here in order to be able to just go towards the end. So the cosmological anthropic principle I've made mention of a number of times. You can see that back there, that was Newsweek, that's in 1997. It's something we'll probably come back to. But what it has to do with are all these variables that we've discovered, and that if any one of them is just slightly different, we don't get the universe we have. And that gives birth to this point of view that says there's something going on here. Dennis Scania, the distinguished head of Cambridge University Observatory, said if you change a little bit the laws of nature, or if you change a little bit the constants of nature, like the charge on the electron, then the way the universe develops is so changed, it's very likely that intelligent life would not have been able to develop. So I'm going to David Deutsch and also Frank Tipler. Frank Tipler's at Tulane University. These two men are the ones who are the primary proponents of the cosmological anthropic principle, one in England and one here in the States. I'm not going to take the time here. These PowerPoints will be up available as files online on Populi, and you can see them there. Paul Davies, I'm going to just keep on going. Well, that Paul Davies quote might be good for you to see. He says, the really amazing thing is not that life on Earth is balanced on a knife edge, but that the entire universe is balanced on a knife edge and would be a total chaos if the natural constants were off even slightly. You see, he says, even if you dismiss man as a chance happening, the fact remains that the universe seems unreasonably suited to the existence of life. Almost contrived, you might say, a put-up job. Arno Penzias, who won the Nobel Prize for discovering the cosmic microwave background radiation of the universe, which was something that Einstein had predicted we would find, is so finely tuned. He said it's so finely tuned that science is leaving us with an impression of a nature behind which you could almost say there's a supernatural plan. And this is Freeman Dyson, famous physicist. The more I examine the universe and the details of its architecture, the more evidence I find that the universe in some sense must have known we were coming. I think I'm going to bypass Hawking, let you look at Hawking on your own. And I'm going to also bypass Alan Sandage. They're both wonderful guys to read what they have to say. This is Simon Conway Morris, the Christian paleontologist, who I've made mention of. His big book recently is Life's Solution. It's really interesting. He puts forth the idea of something called convergence. I don't have time to unpack it here. But he's at Cambridge. He says, he's an Englishman, evolution has metaphysical, that means ultimate reality, implications. The assumption that the world has some meaning which is linked to our own calling as the only morally responsible beings in the world, should say, is an important example of the supernatural aspect of experience which Christian interpretations of the universe explore and develop. He belongs to a growing circle of popular science writers like Paul Davies, Stuart Kauffman, Francis Collins, and Michael Denton, who accept evolution but reject that it's haphazard. So he's speaking about now people like Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and so on, and Daniel Dennett. He says the pronouncements of the ultra-Darwinists can shake with a religious fervor. Richard Dawkins is arguably England's most pious atheist. Their texts ring with high-minded rhetoric and dire warnings, not least of the unmitigated evils of religion, all to reveal the path of simplicity and straight thinking. More than one commentator has noted that ultra-Darwinism has pretensions to a secular religion. And we'll close with this, I believe it is. No, there's one more after this. Michael Turner, the widely quoted astrophysicist at the University of Chicago and Fermilab, describes the fine-tuning of the universe with a simile. He says the precision is as if one could throw a dart across the entire universe, 13.8 billion light years across, and hit a bullseye 1 millimeter in diameter on the other side. And here Sir Lawrence Bragg, an eminent physicist, says science and religion are opposed, but they're opposed like the finger and thumb, so that between them we can grasp anything. And that ends this lecture about